November 20th, 1995. Kensington Palace. The cameras are rolling. Nearly 23 million British viewers are watching BBC's Panorama as Diana, Princess of Wales, sits across from Martin Bashir and proceeds to detonate a bomb under the House of Windsor. She talks about bulimia, infidelity, feeling hunted by the press. But buried in that conversation is something that will echo through royal commentary for decades. Diana describes feeling like a brood mare, chosen for a purpose, discarded once that purpose was served. They only wanted my genes. On the surface, this sounds like a woman expressing pain about being used for baby making, and that reading is valid. But here's the thing. When you trace Diana Spencer's bloodline backward through 5 centuries of English history, that phrase takes on an entirely different dimension. Because Diana wasn't simply young and fertile, she was the carrier of something the House of Windsor desperately needed and couldn't claim through their own lineage. Documented descent from the Stuart kings and, through them, from the Tudors themselves. The blood of the old English monarchs, the blood the Windsors had never possessed. To understand what Diana really meant, you have to understand 2 parallel histories that collided on a summer day in 1981. One is the story of an ancient English noble family with royal blood running through its veins. The other is the story of German imports who changed their name to sound more British. And then you have to ask yourself a question the palace would rather you didn't. Who was really the outsider in that marriage? The Spencer family acquired Althorpe House in Northamptonshire in 1508. Let that date sink in. That's 3 years before Henry VIII became king. The Tudors were barely getting started, and the Spencers were already establishing what would become their ancestral seat for the next 500 years. They'd built their fortune through sheep farming in the 15th century. Smart, practical, English to the bone. By the Tudor era, they were ascending into serious nobility. They received their first noble title in 1603, the exact year Elizabeth I died and the Tudor dynasty ended. By 1765, they'd become Earls Spencer, one of the most respected titles in English aristocracy. But here's what made the Spencers different from ordinary nobles. Through centuries of aristocratic intermarriage, the family had accumulated something extraordinary: descent from the Stuart kings, the last authentically British royal dynasty before the German influx. Diana's ancestry connected her directly to Charles II, the merry monarch who restored the English crown in 1660 after the chaos of civil war. And Charles II? He was a king worth descending from. After Oliver Cromwell died and the Puritan experiment collapsed, England begged Charles to come back from exile and take the throne. He arrived to crowds so thick he could barely move through London. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 wasn't just a political event, it was a national exhale. England had spent years under Puritan rule where theaters were closed, Christmas was banned, and joy itself seemed suspect. Charles brought color back. He reopened the theaters. He patronized the arts. He founded the Royal Society, which would become one of the most important scientific institutions in history. His court at Whitehall became legendary for its wit, its glamour, and, let's be honest, its scandals. Charles had no legitimate children with his queen, Catherine of Braganza, but he had plenty of illegitimate ones. At least 12 acknowledged children by 7 different mistresses. And here's the thing about Charles. He didn't hide them away in shame. He ennobled them. He gave them titles, lands, wealth, positions at court. His illegitimate offspring became dukes and duchesses, founding noble lines that would persist for centuries. Diana descended from 2 of these elevated bastards. Henry Fitzroy was born in 1663, the son of Charles II and Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, one of the most notorious women in English history. Barbara was beautiful, ambitious, and utterly shameless about her position as the king's favorite. She bore Charles 5 children while technically married to another man. Young Henry was created Duke of Grafton at age 9. He grew up at court, served in the military, and died heroically at the Siege of Cork in 1690. His line continued. Diana carried his blood. Charles Lennox was born in 1672, the son of Charles II and Louise de Querouaille, a French noblewoman sent by Louis XIV to seduce the English king. It worked. Charles created his son Duke of Richmond when the boy was just 3 years old. The Richmond dukedom persists to this day, and Diana descended from this line as well. So Diana didn't just have a statistical connection to Stuart royalty. She carried the blood of a king who had transformed English culture, who had defied death and exile to reclaim his throne, and whose personality still echoed through his descendants 3 centuries later. Charles II's charisma, his ability to connect with common people, his instinctive understanding of public relations. Sound familiar? Diana also carried the blood of James II, Charles's brother and successor. A less glamorous connection, admittedly. James was a Catholic who managed to alienate nearly everyone and got himself deposed in 1688. But royal blood is royal blood. The Spencers had it. The Windsors, through their German patrilineage, did not. Why does the Stuart connection matter so much? Because the Stuarts themselves descended from the Tudors. Their claim to the English throne came through Margaret Tudor, eldest daughter of Henry VII, who married James IV of Scotland in 1503. That marriage created the bloodline that would eventually unite the English and Scottish crowns. Diana, through her documented Stuart ancestors, carried Tudor blood, the blood of the dynasty that gave England Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the very concept of an independent English church. Genealogical analysis suggested Diana possessed more verified English royal blood than any consort had brought into the monarchy in over 300 years. Now let's talk about the people she married into. In 1701, the English Parliament faced a problem. Queen Anne was dying. She had no surviving children, and dozens of Catholics had stronger blood claims to the throne than any Protestant candidate. Britain was determined to remain Protestant, so Parliament did something breathtaking in its cynicism. They skipped past more than 50 closer claimants and offered the throne to Sophia of Hanover, a German princess whose only qualification was her Protestant faith. Sophia died before Anne did, so it was her son, George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, who arrived in England in 1714 to become George I. The contrast with Charles II's triumphant return could not have been starker. George was 54 years old when he landed at Greenwich. He was short, shy, and deeply uncomfortable with public attention. He reportedly never learned to speak English properly, communicating with his ministers in French instead. He spent much of his reign traveling back to his German territories, treating his British kingdom as almost an afterthought. Where Charles II had dazzled London with his charm, George I seemed to actively avoid his subjects. And then there were the mistresses. George had left his wife behind in Germany. Literally, he'd imprisoned her in a castle for alleged adultery and never let her out. She died there 32 years later, having never seen her children again. In her place, George brought 2 German mistresses to England. The English court, with characteristic cruelty, nicknamed them the Maypole and the Elephant. Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg was tall and thin, hence the Maypole. Sophia Charlotte von Kielmansegg was, shall we say, more generously proportioned. The English aristocracy was appalled, not by the mistresses themselves — kings having mistresses was nothing new — but by the entire foreign circus that had descended on their court. German attendants, German food, German manners. George didn't even pretend to care about English customs or English sensibilities. He was there because Parliament had invited him, and he would do the minimum required. The satirists had a field day. Jonathan Swift mocked the new regime mercilessly. The Jacobites, supporters of the exiled Stuart claimants, grew bolder. There were riots, assassination plots. The Hanoverian succession was never as secure as the history books make it seem. But George held on, and his descendants, George II, George III, and onward, became progressively more British in culture over the generations. They kept marrying German princesses, though. They maintained their continental connections. The Hanoverian court remained heavily German in character well into the 19th century. And then came Queen Victoria. On February 10th, 1840, Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert was thoroughly German, born in Bavaria, educated in Germany, German-speaking throughout his life. Victoria herself, while born in England, had been raised in a German-speaking household. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, was German. Victoria reportedly considered German her first language. When she married Albert, German became the primary language spoken in their private life. German at home. In the British royal household. The Christmas tree Albert popularized? A German tradition. Victorian aesthetics and morality? Heavily shaped by this German prince. When Victoria died in 1901, her son became Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom, and simultaneously head of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. That German name hung over the monarchy like an uncomfortable truth. Tolerated, ignored, until it couldn't be. July 17, 1917. German Gotha bombers are dropping explosives on London. British soldiers are dying by the hundreds of thousands in trenches fighting German forces. And anti-German sentiment has reached a hysteria that's difficult to comprehend from our distance. German shops weren't just being vandalized, they were being burned. Mobs roamed through London's East End, smashing windows and looting businesses with German-sounding names. The Lusitania's sinking in 1915 had triggered 3 days of nationwide anti-German riots. People with German surnames were losing their jobs, being interned, being attacked in the streets. Dachshunds were being kicked, some reportedly killed, simply for being a German breed. The royal family's German relatives were being stripped of their British titles. Prince Louis of Battenberg, who had served the Royal Navy for 46 years, was forced to resign as First Sea Lord and change his name to Mountbatten. The atmosphere was toxic, paranoid, and sitting at the center of British identity was a king whose family name was indistinguishable from the bombers terrorizing London. On that day, King George V made one of the most consequential decisions in royal history. By royal proclamation, he renounced all German titles held by himself and his family. He invented an entirely new surname for the dynasty. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha ceased to exist. In its place arose the House of Windsor, named after one of the royal family's most English-seeming residences. Masterful wartime propaganda. And a tacit admission that the royal family's German identity had become such a severe liability that it required complete rebranding. The German relatives found this darkly amusing. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's own grandson, now at war with Britain, reportedly joked that he was looking forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg Gotha. The joke landed because everyone understood the absurdity. You can change a name, you can't change blood. The Windsors remained, genetically and historically, a German dynasty ruling over an English throne they'd been invited to occupy by active parliament. Now, to be fair, the 20th century Windsors weren't entirely without British blood. When the future George VI married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, He brought Scottish and English aristocratic heritage into the line. The Queen Mother, as she'd become known, was indisputably British. Her family had roots in Scotland stretching back centuries. This injection of British aristocracy helped soften the monarchy's German image. But here's what the Queen Mother couldn't provide: royal blood. The Bowes-Lyons were noble, yes, but they had no documented descent from British kings. They were aristocrats, not royalty. The Queen Mother made the family more British in the aristocratic sense, but she couldn't transform them into descendants of Charles II or James II. That gap in the Windsor lineage remained unfilled. Until 1981. Consider what the palace saw when they looked at Lady Diana Spencer in the late 1970s. She was the youngest daughter of Edward John Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer. Born July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham estate, literally on royal land, her family already intertwined with the crown through generations of service. The Spencers had been courtiers to English monarchs for centuries, their loyalty and Englishness beyond question. Diana was young, only 19 when seriously considered as a bride for Charles. She was beautiful, charming, and seemingly pliable. But crucially, she came with genealogical credentials that the palace understood intimately. The Spencers represented something the Windsors needed, not just English aristocracy. They had that through the Queen Mother. What they needed was documented royal blood connecting to the Stuart kings. Diana's ancestry traced directly to Charles II and James II through verified genealogical lines. Her family had held Althorp since 1508. When the Hanoverians arrived in 1714, the Spencers had already been English nobles for over 200 years. The selection process for Charles's bride was notoriously clinical, and at the center of it was a woman named Lady Fermoy. Ruth Fermoy was Diana's maternal grandmother, and also a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. She moved in the innermost circles of the palace. She understood what the institution needed, and she understood exactly what her granddaughter could provide. Lady Fermoy helped engineer the match. She facilitated introductions. She vouched for Diana's character and, more importantly, for Diana's suitability. When questions arose about whether Diana was appropriate for the heir to the throne, Lady Fermoy was there to smooth them over. The palace required candidates to be Protestant. Diana was. They required candidates to come from good families. The Spencers were impeccable. And then there was the other requirement, the one that seems medieval until you remember this was 1980. Diana's virtue had to be verified. The palace needed assurance that the future Princess of Wales had no romantic history that could embarrass the crown. In an era when Charles himself had been photographed with multiple girlfriends, when his affair with Camilla Parker Bowles was already known within court circles, Diana was subjected to scrutiny that seems almost absurd in retrospect. Her past relationships were investigated. Her reputation was examined. The message was clear. The heir could have a history, but his bride could not. Diana passed inspection. She was deemed suitable, pure enough, noble enough, and, though this was never stated publicly, genetically valuable enough. The contrast between the cold calculation behind the scenes and the fairy tale narrative presented to the public was staggering. The press gushed about romance, about a shy kindergarten teacher who had captured the prince's heart. Shy Di, they called her. The Cinderella story. Love conquering all. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, it was a strategic merger, an acquisition of bloodlines. The institution had identified what it lacked: Stuart royal blood, Tudor connections, documented English lineage, and it had found a source. Diana was 19 years old and had no idea what she was walking into. July 29th, 1981. An estimated 750 million people worldwide watched Lady Diana Spencer walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral to marry Charles, Prince of Wales. The press dubbed her Shy Di. They portrayed her as the commoner who'd won the heart of the prince. A fairy tale narrative. Cinderella in a designer wedding gown. The framing was almost exactly backward. Diana was called a commoner because she lacked a royal title. But calling a Spencer a commoner was like calling a Medici a shopkeeper. Her family had been at the heart of English power for 5 centuries. Her blood connected her to Charles II and James II, kings whose descendants had been deliberately excluded from the throne by the Act of Settlement. In terms of Stuart royal credentials, Diana was arguably contributing more to this marriage than she was receiving. She was joining a family that had needed to literally rename itself during World War I to avoid sounding like the enemy. A family whose patriarch had arrived from Hanover, unable to speak English. A family whose legitimacy rested not on ancient blood, but on a parliamentary decision to exclude Catholics. And they were calling her the commoner. The marriage represented a strategic genetic merger. The Windsors gained access to Spencer blood, Stuart blood, Tudor-connected blood, 5 centuries of English nobility, with documented descent from British kings, that would flow into future heirs and strengthen the dynasty's claim to being authentically royal, rather than merely parliamentary imports. Diana's children would carry the genetic legacy of England's oldest royal houses, alongside their Windsor inheritance. For an institution still quietly sensitive about the circumstances of its founding, this was invaluable. They wanted her genes. They got them. The fairy tale soured almost immediately. Charles had been in love with Camilla Parker Bowles before the wedding. He reportedly resumed his affair within 5 years of the marriage. Diana, isolated within the palace, struggled with bulimia and depression. She'd later described feeling desperately unhappy almost from the beginning, trapped in an institution that valued her function more than her person. She was expected to produce heirs. She did. William in 1982, Harry in 1984. She was expected to perform her public duties without complaint. Her emotional needs? Her desire for a genuine partnership with her husband? Her struggles with mental health? Inconveniences to be managed, not problems to be solved. The separation came in 1992, the same year Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story, a book secretly authorized by Diana herself through taped conversations. For the first time, the world heard her perspective, the loneliness, the eating disorders, the sense that she'd been used and discarded. She spoke of feeling like a brood mare, valued for what she could produce, not for who she was. 3 years later came the Panorama interview. Diana sat before Martin Bashir's cameras and laid bare her understanding of her role within the institution. She spoke of Charles's infidelity with devastating precision. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She discussed her own affairs. She questioned whether Charles was suited to be king. But threaded through the headline-grabbing revelations was Diana's articulation of something deeper. Her sense that the royal family had valued her genetics more than her humanity. And when you understand what Diana brought to the marriage genealogically, her words take on their full weight. The institution had selected her from among all possible brides, in part because she carried what they lacked: Stuart royal blood that could finally connect the Windsor line to the old British kings. They'd wanted her Spencer ancestry, her Tudor connections, her documented descent from Charles II and James II. They'd wanted to inject her DNA into the Windsor line to strengthen its claim to ancient royal legitimacy. Once she'd delivered 2 sons, both carrying Spencer blood, her value to the institution diminished. She'd served her purpose. Diana's statement wasn't just the complaint of a woman unhappy in her marriage. It was recognition of a profound truth about her role in the Windsor project. They wanted her genes. They got them. And then they had little use for the woman who'd provided them. The divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana lost her HRH title but retained the designation Princess of Wales. She was given a substantial financial settlement and continued her charity work, remaining perhaps the most famous woman in the world. 1 year later, on August 31, 1997, Diana died in a Paris car crash alongside Dodi Fayed while being pursued by paparazzi. She was 36 years old. The public response was unlike anything the monarchy had experienced. An outpouring of grief so intense it briefly threatened to delegitimize the royal family entirely. Approximately 2.5 billion people watched her funeral on September 6, 1997, one of the most viewed events in television history. The institution that had rejected Diana, that had made her feel like an outsider and a broodmare, was forced to publicly mourn her under overwhelming public pressure. The Queen, initially criticized for remaining at Balmoral rather than returning to London, eventually gave a televised address praising Diana. The family Diana had felt excluded from now had to acknowledge before the entire world how much she had meant. Not to them, to everyone else. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Doesn't everyone in Europe descend from Charlemagne? Isn't this whole bloodline argument meaningless because, statistically speaking, anyone with European ancestry is probably connected to medieval royalty somewhere? The objection has mathematical merit. Geneticists have estimated that virtually everyone of European descent shares ancestry with Charlemagne if you go back far enough. The number of ancestral slots in your family tree doubles with each generation. 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, until the numbers become astronomical. Go back 30 generations, and you theoretically have over 1 billion ancestor slots, far more than the entire population of medieval Europe. Lines cross and recross. Almost everyone shares descent from almost everyone. But here's why Diana's ancestry is different. The distinction lies between statistical ancestry and documented ancestry. Yes, you might be descended from Charlemagne through some pathway that can never be verified. Diana had traceable, recorded descent from specific Stuart kings through specific named individuals across specific generations. Her connection to Charles II wasn't a probability calculation. It was documented fact, verified through parish records, noble genealogies, and centuries of meticulous record-keeping that the Spencer family maintained. When discussing royal legitimacy, documented lineage matters in ways that statistical probability doesn't. And if you want evidence that royal succession is more arbitrary than the palace would like you to believe, consider the case of Mike Hastings, an Australian forklift driver who died in 2012. Hastings was the senior male line descendant of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother of Edward IV. Under certain interpretations of succession rules, he had a stronger claim to the English throne than Elizabeth II. The Hastings claim rests on a historical wrong from 1478, when George was attainted for treason and his descendants barred from succession. Remove that attainder as unjust, and the Hastings line arguably supersedes the current royals. A 2004 Channel 4 documentary explored this claim. They found Hastings living in the Australian outback, completely uninterested in pressing his royal credentials. The relevance to Diana's story is this: royal succession isn't some pure, unbroken chain of divine right. It's a political construction, shaped by acts of parliament, religious tests, convenient attainders of inconvenient claimants. The Windsors rule because Parliament chose Protestant Germans over Catholic Britons in 1701. That choice was legitimate under the laws Parliament made. But it was still a choice, not destiny. A decision. So what do we make of all this? Diana Spencer was framed as the outsider, the commoner who married up, the girl who didn't quite understand how things worked in the palace, the one who didn't fit. But trace the bloodlines, follow the genealogies, look at who actually descended from English kings and who descended from German imports invited by Parliament because they were willing to be Protestant. Diana carried the blood of Charles II and James II, of the Tudors through the Stuart line. Her family had been English nobility since before the Reformation. She descended from a king whose charm and charisma had restored the monarchy itself, and 3 centuries later, she displayed those same qualities in a way the stiff Windsors never could. The Windsors? Their founder couldn't speak English. Their name was Saxe-Coburg Gotha, until the Germans started bombing London and it became too embarrassing. Their claim to the throne rests on an act of parliament, not ancient blood. The court that greeted George I mocked his German mistresses and tolerated his indifference to England. And his descendants spent the next 2 centuries trying to become what Diana already was. Diana wasn't the outsider. She was the English princess who married into a German family that had rebranded itself to seem legitimate. And when she'd given them what they needed, her genes, her ancestry, her children, who would carry Spencer blood into the future, they had no further use for her. The genes they wanted? They got them. They're now in the future king. William carries Diana's Stuart ancestry, her Tudor connections, her documented descent from English kings that the Windsor line had never possessed through its German patrilineage. And when William married Kate Middleton, who, as it happens, is his 11th cousin through shared ancestry, even that union quietly reinforced Diana's genetic legacy rather than diluting it. The institution that rejected Diana now depends on her genetic legacy for whatever claim to ancient royal blood it possesses. That's not irony. That's vindication. Subscribe for more stories like this.